Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Now, to look at whether there is a classical influence on modern Northern Irish literature is perhaps far too broad a project for a 35 to 40-minute talk on a Tuesday lunchtime. Of course, there is plenty of evidence for it. It runs through our literature as a whole like letters through a stick of rock, and in a wide range of genres. So I thought what might be perhaps more interesting is to look at any examples of where Latin or Greek is physically embedded within a piece of modern Irish writing, and to consider the modern writer's choice of source material used and his purpose in doing this. So with that in mind, I intend to look in detail at Seamus Heaney's poem Route 110 and his very specific use of Virgil's Aeneid 6, and then examine what this and the associated web of connections has to say about the issue of both writers' attitudes to conflict and its consequences. But first, a bit of context. As the Roman Empire declined and eventually fell, it bequeathed to Europe a common language and culture, Latin. But as time went on, this Latin inheritance, mediated as it was through the Church, was seen often as being hostile to embryonic nations, splitting as it did the loyalties of its citizens between their ruler and their pope. So we tend to find a tendency to place sharp temporal borders or boundaries around Latin literature, putting an end point to it somewhere around 200 AD, and at the same time claiming a starting point for modern national literatures at around the 13th century. So in order for national literary canons to flourish as distinct and distinctive entities in their own rights, the Latin tradition had to be seen as having died, or at least having reached the end of its influence. Cultural overlaps can be seen, therefore, as compromising the new literary world order, if you like. And this breaks the commonality of our Latin inheritance for the Babel-like demarcations of new, individualised national literatures. But in Ireland, as so often, things were very different. Latin as a language has a long and complex tradition in this island, which interestingly doesn't seem to have had any limiting endpoint imposed on it. As W.B. Stanford points out in his survey Towards a History of Classical Influences in Ireland, there is clear evidence for a widespread knowledge of and familiarity with classical language and literature throughout Irish history, often evidenced by its influence on literature written in Irish. Indeed, we know that Latin and Greek were actively taught in hedge schools from around 59, I should say, in spite of penal laws prohibiting such activity. Therefore, it may not be fanciful to suggest that more of the Irish peasantry were familiar with Homer and Virgil than would have been the case with their social counterparts on the mainland at that time. So it can be no real surprise to us to find the footprints of Latin and its literature present within the works of many notable Irish literary figures, both those who wrote in English and in Irish. And indeed, we can find no better example of the presence of Latin within modern Northern Irish literature than Seamus Heaney, particularly within his poem Route 10, the longest poem in his 2010 collection Human Chain. 2010 in Northern Ireland saw the usual mixture of turbulence and talks. January began on a positive note, with the UDA confirming that all weaponry under its control had been put verifiably beyond use. But as the year wore on, disputes between Sinn Féin and the DUP over the devolution of policing and justice laws formed an ongoing backdrop to the now familiar ritual of rioting, sporadic shootings and bombings by dissident groups and disturbances over the 12th. Much had changed for the better since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but just over 10 years later, the casual observer could be forgiven for thinking that much still remained the same. In this uncertain and volatile landscape, Seamus Heaney published Human Chain, acclaimed at the time as something of a returned form. The overriding themes of the book seem to be regret and loss, as Heaney often looks back at his past and the people who figured in it. But if there is a presiding spirit which really haunts this book, it is Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, the book in which Virgil's hero, the Trojan warrior Aeneas, travels to the underworld to visit the ghost of his dead father Anchises, in order to gain guidance not just for the rest of his journey to his new, as yet unknown home, but for the mission which lay ahead, ordained by the gods, to find a second Troy, even greater than the first, which would be the mistress of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. In Stepping Stones, his book of interviews with the poet and critic Dennis O'Driscoll, Heaney says, "There is one Virgilian journey that has indeed been a constant presence, and that is Aeneas's venture into the underworld. The motifs in Book 6 have been in my head for years. The Golden Bough, Charon's barge, the quest to meet the shade of his father." Now, Human Chain is indeed a book of shadows and memories, of things whispered and hinted at, of journeys into the underworld, elegies and translations, of echoes and silences. And the most ambitious poem in the whole book is an ingenious replaying of Aeneid 6, starting with a description of finding and buying a second-hand copy of the book in Smithfield Market in Belfast and taking it home along Route 10 across the province, from Cookstown to Bayatoon and Mackerfeld. Slowly the poem moves into the underworld of Heaney's past, where he revisits, amongst others, Louis O'Neill, a family friend murdered in the Troubles, and wanders through a world of shady memories and ghosts before re-emerging into the light of the present in the last section, with a final stanza about the birth of his first grandchild. In his essay on James Joyce's Ulysses, Order and Myth, T.S. Eliot coined the phrase mythic method to explain how he saw Joyce's use of Homer's Odyssey in the novel as a way of manipulating the continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity. Now, what I think he means by this is that the Odyssey provides Joyce with a way of ordering and giving shape to what Eliot calls the immense panorama of futility and anarchy, which is contemporary history. And not much has changed since 1923, I'm afraid. In other words, by using our shared classical inheritance, a poet can bring structure and meaning to his own work, and perhaps also use it to shed light on the concerns of the present. So, by paying careful attention to ancient texts, the patterning and meaning of words from the past, and the embedding of them within a contemporary context, a modern poet can say much more and at many, many more levels about the world in which he finds himself now. Therefore, as Homer's Odyssey offered Joyce a means of shaping his uniquely complex novel by drawing the past into the present, for Heaney it is Virgil's Aeneid 6 which performs a similar function in Route 110, and allows him the freedom to engage simultaneously in an act of both creation and, in fact, recreation. We might almost say that this use of Book 6 as both model and stimulus also allows for two Heaneys. One, the new Virgil, leading the reader through a complex emotional and political journey, and the other, a modern Aeneid, whose journey through the darker places of his past will inevitably shape his future. And all of this is achieved through a new take on his ancient source material. So let's start to look at the poem itself. Route 110 starts with a close-up. Heaney, as a boy, in the classic section of a second-hand bookshop, buying an old copy of Aeneid 6. The woman serving it in the shop is studied closely. She deliberates the cost of the book and then she wraps it up. She represents, in a practical form, Virgil's Sibyl, whom we meet at the start of Book 6. Now, the description here, as you can see, is hardly complimentary. In a stained front-buttoned shop coat, sere brown piped with crimson, smelling of dry rot and disinfectant, she emerges. The overwhelming effect here is of decay. Sere implies something dry or withered, and dry rot, as we unfortunately all know, is something which, having been present for a long time, gradually damages and destroys wood by absorbing moisture and therefore life from its host. The fact that everything here is predominantly brown fits well with the imagery. It's worth remembering at this point that the Sibyl of Cumae, the same Sibyl who features in Book 6, was usually depicted as a withered old crone who aged, but alas, could never die, living in a cave, writing on the dried leaves at the entrance. Her prophecies were the result of possession or inspiration, depending on which way you looked at it, by Apollo, the god of poetry and prophecy, which seemed to absorb her very essence, leaving behind just the mere dry husk of the Sibyl. Heaney also seems to absorb the shop assistant's breath along with the volume of poetry, almost as if she were a double source of inspiration. By extending the book of the ancient poem to him, she inducts Heaney into its mysteries and its hero, just like the Sibyl introduces Aeneas to the underworld, with its links to his past, as well as his and Rome's future. In other words, as a bookseller, she is both the preserver of the old books themselves in the shop, as well as being the purveyor of the knowledge they contain. Through the exchange of money and book, Heaney becomes both participant in and preserver of Virgil's poem. And it's perhaps worth noting here that Heaney doesn't buy an English translation of the Aeneid, but he buys the Latin text itself, thus emphasizing that he doesn't need a mediator to understand it. He can go straight to the source. Heaney's field of vision expands in section 2. He moves outside the anonymous bookshop into a bustling Smithfield on a Saturday afternoon. Here, Virgil is actually named for the first time, so the scene changes rapidly and will continue to do so throughout the 12 sections of Route 110. Virgil, as book and poet, is still with us as a very conscious presence. I hurried on, shortcutting to the buses, parrying the crush with my bagged Virgil. There's a sense in these lines that Heaney is almost warding off the people heading like him for the bus home with his precious purchase, as if it were some kind of magic charm to repel danger and to transport its bearer safely elsewhere, much in the way that the golden boy ensures Aeneas' safe passage to and through the underworld. There's further references to Book 6 in this section. Smithfield has been alive with birdsong from its many pet shops, melodious with canaries green and gold. But as Heaney hurries towards his destination, we can sense a change. Silent now as birdless Lake Avernus. Avernus was a place. It was actually situated northwest of modern Naples, and in antiquity it was believed to be one of the entrances to the underworld. It also is the gateway through which Aeneas and the Sibyl descend into Hades on their journey in Book 6 to visit Anchises, Aeneas' father, and learn about the future of Rome. So, as the reader also journeys from bookshop to bus station, we follow from Heaney's introduction from the bookseller on a journey, which has its deliberate resonances with Aeneas's voyage of discovery, and indeed self-discovery, in the world of the dead. The reference to Book 6 itself is very specific. He wants us to recall line 242, where Virgil describes a cave beside Avernus, a lake over which no birds can fly. It is the place the Greeks called by the name Avernus. Now, Avernus is derived actually from two Greek words, a, meaning without, and ornis, birds. So Virgil is making an etymological point here, and this is actually replicated by Heaney, who deftly turns Smithfield, filled with birdsong, into a soundless, birdless Avernus, and so transports us straight to a specific moment in Book 6, when Aeneas and his companion prepare to enter an unknown world of ghosts and darkness. In the process, as bodies become insubstantial and life's transience is replaced by the vast eternity of Hades, the birdsong too fades into silence. In Heaney's version, a series of inanimate objects, school bags, maps, prints, plaques, artificial flowers, all remnants of lives once lived, bring us to this section's climax. Then racks of suits and overcoats that swayed when one was tugged from its overcrowded frame, like their owner's shades, close packed onto Charon's barge. The clothes in display here are now without owners, and therefore bodiless and empty, like Virgil's description of the occupants of the underworld, because in both cases nothing physical remains of their living, embodied pasts. Just the intangibility of the ghosts of the lives they once lived and the identities that they once held. Heaney also takes us right to where these ghosts are located, crowding onto Charon's barge as he ferries them to their ultimate destination in Hades, or, in Heaney's case, the 110 bus to Cookstown via Tube and Mangrove, tellingly moving from east to west, towards the setting sun and the end of light. In Heaney's vision, the bus inspector plays the role of Charon, sorting out his passengers for their various destinations, Hell, Elysium, Rebirth, while comparing the passengers to agitated rooks around a rookery, thus linking and amplifying his version to Aeneas' source. Charon's passengers in Book 6 are simply described as many birds who flock together. Rooks have usually been considered to be unlucky birds, connected to death, who also live in flocks. This addition to the original source material adds considerably to the sense of gloom and foreboding. As we move to section 4, the first time we actually get a close look at the figure of Heaney himself, we notice that he is wearing his second-hand railway guard's coat, tarpaulin stiff, coal black, sharp-cuffed as slate. Suffering its scourge at the neck and wrists was worth it, even so, for the dismay I caused by doorstep night arrivals, a creature of cold blasts, flat-winged rain. The emphasis on coal black and flat-winged, of course, brings us back to the roots of the previous section, but the whole business of the coat really brings us back to section 2. Unlike the rails of suits or the overcoats he noticed on the way to the bus station, Heaney's coat still encloses a living human being, reminding us that Aeneas too was remarkable amongst the hosts on Charon's boat, because his human, corporeal self weighs it down and threatens to in fact sink it. Heaney's world of the dead, though, will soon become technology, don't you just? Heaney's world of the dead will soon become a major part of his poem, and this is signalled at the start of section 5 by his neighbour McNichol's pigeons, taking over from Venus's twin doves of Book 6, which lead him into his kitchen, where he finds each head of oats, a silver smattering, each individual grain wrapped in a second husk of glittering foil. Here again, the presence of Book 6 is signalled. Aeneas's golden boy, his key to the underworld, here has been changed into a head of oats. But each grain is individually wrapped in tinfoil, giving a sort of shimmering effect. In Aeneid 6, when Aeneas discovers the golden boy, Virgil describes the tree on which it grows like this: a tree whose branches radiated gold's breath of contrasting hue, discolor auri, as the Latin says. We can clearly see that Heaney's stalks wrapped in foil are meant to equate to Virgil's discolor auri, in that the light provided by both allows Heaney and Aeneas to move from one dimension of being to another, from life to death. But there's a further point to be made here. It functions in Heaney as a symbol of transition from a youth lived in peacetime to the period which we now know as leading into the Troubles, referred to at the beginning of section 6 as the Age of Ghosts. Let's try this again. Do you know what? I'm not going to do anything.
I will do it. I think I
You do.
Yeah.
In the poem's next 4 sections, we have a series of incidents connected to Heaney's experience of death and dark times. Firstly, his first full wake after his friend Michael Mulholland's death by drowning in sections 6 and 7. His first experience of serious love in section 8. Next one. That's it. Perfect. You can stay. You're hard.
Yeah.
And deaths during the Troubles. Mr. Lavery, Louis O'Neill, and Bloody Sunday, which we find in section 9. In the same way as Virgil has Aeneas as he makes his way through the underworld also enter into a period of retrospection as he meets individuals from his past life, so Heaney cleverly replicates in his own reflection on his past experiences as he moves from darkness to light. In this way, Michael Mulholland, the young neighbour who had recently drowned, described in Heaney's memorable line, "Their own dear, ill-advised son-brother swimmer," can be mapped onto the ghost of Palinurus, Aeneas' helmsman, who drowns when Somnus, the god of sleep, throws him into the sea just at the moment when the Trojans are within sight of their destination. Palinurus survives for 3 nights in the sea, and on the 4th night he too reaches the Italian shore, but only to be driven back and then drowned. Similarly, Mulholland's wake, which starts incidentally without a body, is kept going by the conversation for 3 nights, and it's only on the 4th night, when his drowned body is found and finally placed in its coffin, can the ritual of sorrow actually come to an end. In Book 6, Aeneas promises Palinurus' ghost that his corpse will be found and honoured so that his ghost can cross the Styx and find peace at last. Whereas Virgil's main concern here is Aeneas' failure as a leader to look after his men, Heaney tweaks his focus to give us the first example of an untimely, undeserved fate, which he will explore in greater detail in the next 2 sections. Section 8 opens with a direct reference to the second significant ghost from Aeneas' past to confront him in the underworld, Dido, the tragic queen of Carthage and lover of Aeneas, who committed suicide when he left her behind to pursue his mission. The opening line in Heaney, "As one when the month is young sees a new moon," is in fact a close rendering of one of the most striking images in Virgil's Book 6. Aeneas recognised her, dim through the shadows, even as someone who at the start of the month either sees or thinks he has seen the moon through the clouds. Virgil's emphasis here is in evoking the dim shadows of the underworld and the fact that Dido, once such a vital, vivid presence in the poem, has dwindled so much that this vision of her is so insubstantial that it might only exist in Aeneas's mind. This comparison is therefore drawn into Heaney's poem through the opening line in this section, along with other references to Dido. Her hurt still new clearly echoes what we have here, Dido with her wounds still fresh. Even Heaney's backward glance towards the girl's house as he unlocks his car and makes to leave echoes Aeneas' final glance back at Carthage as he sails away, wondering at the fires which illuminate the skyline. The implication here seems to be that the girl he leaves behind, or at least his love for her, like Dido, will not survive his departure. Another young life, if you like, which ends before its time, hurt, rejected, undeserving. We now turn to section 9 and to the realistic examples of the pointless deaths caused by the Troubles in this most striking of stanzas. And what in the end was there left to bury of Mr. Lavery, blown up in his own pub as he bore the prime device and bears it still, mid-morning, towards the sun-admiring door of Ashley House, or of Louis O'Neill, in the wrong place the Wednesday they buried 13, who'd been shot in Derry. These victims of war are directly linked to the final ghost met by Aeneas in Book 6, Deiphobus, the son of Priam who married Helen after Paris' death, only to be butchered by a vengeful Menelaus and his Greeks. Whereas Aeneas didn't recognise Dido because she is barely visible, he now fails to recognise Deiphobus because he has been mutilated beyond easy recognition, even by someone who knows him very well. What is shared by Mr. Lavery, blown to pieces by a bomb, and Deiphobus, slaughtered through the treachery of his Greek wife, is the tangible gruesomeness that armed conflict brings. Aeneas' journey through the underworld forces him to reflect on the pointlessness of the pain which the gods have inflicted on the victims of violence and betrayal. Heaney mimics this in his own journey, in the futile loss of a young friend at sea, to the private hurt which he brings to a girl he loves but has to leave, and last of all, the public anguish which warfare brings to everyone. And what links both writers? A sense of quiet rage in both of them at the brutality which is central to these scenes in both poems. The remaining sections of Break 110 continue to show how deeply embedded Aeneid 6 is within each part of Heaney's poem. Section 10 shows us a version of Elysium, the land of the blessed, as Heaney puts it, not unlike a sports day in Balaki. Lovely. Along with recordings of Slim Whitman singing in the background. Not my idea of Elysium. Section 11, Anchises' theory of the rebirth of souls. Among shades and shadows stirring on the brink, stood there waiting, watching, needy and ever needier for translation. And finally, section 12 announces the age of births, a version of the parade of Romans' future heroes and Aeneas' return to the lighter life of the upper world, as Heaney muses, as her earthlight breaks and we gather round, talking baby talk. But two elements are missing here. The last name on the roll call of Roman heroes is Marcellus, Augustus' nephew and heir, who dies in his 20s in 23 BC. The very epitome of all the tragedy of potential stifled by premature death. Also, as Aeneas leaves the world of the dead, fired up by his vision of Rome's future greatness, Virgil cuts away to a description of the two gates out of the underworld. There are two gates of sleep, one of which they say is made of horn and offers easy passage to true visions. The other has a luminous, dense ivory sheen, but through it, to the sky above, The spirits of the dead send up false dreams. The fact that Aeneid leaves through the ivory gate passes almost unnoticed, coming as it does at the end of an exceptionally long poem, and we might almost share Aeneas's relief to be out of there and up again into the light. Both elements allow Virgil to cast a dark shadow on the future, even as our hero returns to the sunlit uplands of life. He's full of optimism and hope, but the hints are clearly visible that Virgil himself has doubts. He seems to be saying that Rome's future is a false dream, a dream to be finally snuffed out with the death of Marcellus, a dream built on fraternal strife and civil war. But in Route 110, Heaney seems to make a conscious and deliberate choice not to reference either Marcellus's death or the Gate of False Dreams. These are two key features in the end of Book 6, so it's rather curious, given the intricacies we've seen of Heaney's intertextual use of his Virgilian source. Perhaps, the answer is simple and very human. The new grandchild represents new life and growth, new hope, progress continues, a healing after past sorrows. In 2010, it surely seemed possible that here, in Heaney's native land, we had passed through our own particular Hades and could look with confidence at a new generation who, like Anna Rose, Heaney's granddaughter, had never known and would never know the peculiar darkness of political and civil conflict. And in such a landscape, can there be room for a Marcellus or a Gate of Ivory? But Heaney, like Virgil, is a subtle poet. Writing as he was in 2010, Heaney could not have known that Stormont would fall just 6 years later, and again now. He could not have foreseen the return of dissident violence that led to the death of a writer in the streets of Derry in 2019, one of the renewed souls, as Virgil puts it, whose lethe-infused life as a ceasefire baby should have led to a new shared future. A second Troy, as Yeats would have it, only better. No. He could not have known any of this. Yet, within Irish literature, and also interestingly in Latin literature, where the term baptized or bard implies an ability to see into the future, there is a tradition of regarding poets sometimes as prophets. So, might we therefore read Route 110 as more than an exercise in Virgilian intertextuality or Heaneian autobiography, but rather as a subtly coded warning of things to come? Both Aeneid 6 and Route 110 end with new dawns, but Virgil's dawn is a false one. Marcellus dies before his time, an Augustan ceasefire baby who never fulfills his potential, and Aeneas himself leaves through the Gate of False Dreams. But Heaney was too shrewd an observer and much too good a classicist not to join the dots. Perhaps aware of that the intertextual subtleties of Route 110 might at one point be beyond a generation less well equipped to spot them and understand their relevance, it can surely be no accident that Heaney returned again to Aeneid 6 for what was to be his final published work, laying bare in its translation his source and its warning for all to read. And I'm going to leave you with a quotation from Heaney's translation of Aeneid 6. It is easy to descend into Avernus. Death's dark door stands open day and night. But to retrace your steps and get back to the upper air, that is the task. That is the undertaking.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk, and I have to say Lynn is very happy to take some questions if anyone has any
Happy is maybe an exaggeration, but yeah, especially if there's any Heaney experts out there. But happy to take any questions.
If anybody's any comments or questions or I might ask something.
Okay.
So I know that you were focusing on Heaney today, and on that particular poem, but it does seem that in Irish poetry, a lot of poets turn to the classics and the classic writers, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that and why that might be a kind of something that they keep going back to.
It's something actually. Glad you asked that, because it's actually something which I'm working on at the minute anyway, but it really does run through Irish literature in a much more remarkable way even than English literature, because if I gave you a roll call of poets past and present who have this classical influence, you've got Louis MacNeice. I've got to mention Michael Longley being an old boy of Ince, I'll get that in there. Derek Mahon, Yeats, Frank McGuinness, whose play Carthaginians leans heavily on Aeneid 4, in fact. Tom Paulin in his poem The Riot Act. Patrick Deneen, who manages to equate Virgil with nationalism, which is really an interesting read. And even going right back to the 11th and 12th centuries, we find adaptations and even translations. I think there are more adaptations and translations of the Aeneid into Irish, with the Togol Troy in the 11th century, which particularly focuses on the destruction of Troy in Aeneid 2, and the Intiacta Aeneasa, which is the 12th century version of the Aeneid, which is super interesting for tragic people like me, because instead of it being a man being the hero, what the Irish writer does is take the female characters and put them in the foreground. And that is a particularly unique point of view. So not only in Irish literature do we pay our respects to our classical heritage, we take it and we make something new out of it. And I think that is just fabulous. And I think the reason for it is that it is ingrained within our souls. We tend to think of literatures as either strongly Celtic or strongly British. And that's I think we're missing a trick here, because actually our inheritance comes from Greece and Rome. Think about the plays Heaney wrote, the Burial at Thebes and things like that. He went straight to Sophocles and could go straight to Sophocles. Why? Because he was taught Latin and Greek at school. Now, you would expect me to go, yay, given my job. But nevertheless, this is something really important in Irish literature. We go to the fountainhead, we go to the source, and we make it new. We make it different in a way that is unique to us from the 11th century, and we keep on trucking. I think that is true. Even recently, I know that there are going to be Irish versions of Medea, for example, being worked on at the moment. Now, that I want to see. Because if ever there was a play, if ever there was an ancient text that really, really should be Irishized, it really should be that. That's
sounds very exciting, actually. You just there you are.
Well, what's going to happen in the future when they do people know?
That is not going to happen because people like me are here to see them. And also because a little bit, I know it's hard to believe, but I've been a teacher for a long time. Look at me, who could say? But it's in the same way as my teachers handed me their most precious thing, which was the love for this subject. And I owe everything to them. I can see one at the back. And I owe them everything. It's my responsibility to hand that torch, not just to the people I teach, many of whom had gone on to read classics in some form or another at university and have gone into teaching themselves, but to other younger teachers, to tell them that in whatever way we do it, we keep it alive. At the moment, I'm actually working with a friend of mine who teaches in a secondary school in Crossgar. Now, nobody there learns Latin or Greek, but they love Greek myths. And so we're going to get at it through drama. And I've already said to some of the children, I bet you could do Latin. That's how it goes. And they go, no, we can't. And if you show it to them, and you introduce it by whatever means it is, whether it's Marvel superheroes, whether it's drama, whether it's Percy Jackson, whether it is somebody who simply likes, like me, the mechanics of the language and stuff, it doesn't matter. So while I am here, I know there's a generation of teachers coming after me. And if there's not, I'm coming back, a bit like Dido, I want them from beyond the grave.
I should just say that my daughter is studying classics in England at the moment, so and she said, I'd love to be here, Dad.
Yes.
So there are young people who are still doing that. I wondered, you mentioned about the influence of Greece on Heaney. Obviously, the Iliad impacted, the Iliad, well, not the Iliad, the Odyssey impacted on Aeneid. Do you think it impacted on Heaney as well?
The Odyssey?
Yes.
Yes, I think so. I think it's in a different way. I mean, when we talk about the impact of the Odyssey on Irish literature, the go-to place is usually Joyce, as I referenced in the talk, because it's very clear that, you know, that is the model in which he bases the whole Ulysses. In Joyce, I think it mediates its way through plays more than actually the poetry as such, because I think we tend to see characters in the plays with more than a touch of Odysseus in them. But in something like Route 110, of course there is an influence from the Odyssey, since we know that the Aeneid itself, if we look at all 12 books of it together, it's got the first half is the Odyssey, basically, redone, and the second half is the Iliad, redone. So they say there's nothing new under the sun, there really isn't. But I think because he is doing his own little Odyssey here, he actually is much more influenced, I think, by the Odyssey than the Iliad. I would have been intrigued to see what Heaney might have done, actually, with the Iliad, because I can remember attending a series of lectures in Cambridge that he gave about the eclogues. Now, I hate the eclogues, because it's all nymphs and shepherds and blah-de-da, or so I thought. But after sitting listening to him talk about it, with obviously his agricultural knowledge, I went back to it and saw it quite differently. And although I do love the Iliad, I love the Odyssey more, and I think I might have been interested in what he might have done with the Iliad. But yes, absolutely.
Anyone else? Yeah. James often in his interviews pointed out that he hadn't studied Greek.
Yes.
But he obviously had enough interest to speak about Avernus as the Virgilian Avernus.
Yes.
I'm very pleased to talk about the etymology of Avernus.
Thank you.
The Virgilian Avernus. It also reminds me of the Silent Valley.
Oh, yes.
The Virgilian Silent Valley.
Oh, that's a really good point. Thank you for saying that, actually, because of course the Silent Valley.
Yeah. By the way, I don't know if you have any contact with your former colleague, my old classmate, Bill Bennett.
I do, yeah.
Who was a legend in Inst.
Yes.
And but I wanted to ask you, in this particular section, since the Aeneas is going to the underworld to see his father, and Anticheises, that there isn't a section or something more about same as his own father.
That's really interesting, actually, because of course there isn't, is there? And the purposes, I think what that highlights, a very interesting question highlights, is the fact that the purposes of the two poets are actually in some ways quite different. Aeneas does get to see his father Anchises, of course, and it is, I shudder to say, one of the duller sections of the poems. Anyone whom I've ever taught will know that I have absolutely no time for Anchises whatsoever. He gets the directions wrong in Aeneid 3. He's always piping up at points you really wish he wouldn't. And when he gets down to Elysium, I think Anchises has made it the most boring place on earth, with or without Slim Whitman. But I think his purpose, Aeneas' purpose is obviously to visit his father to get information. But I think why Heaney made the choice he made, and this is just my opinion and my view, is because although Aeneas goes to see his daddy, that's really not why he's there. He's really there to get the information about the future of Rome and all that other stuff. So I think he possibly felt that he could unclutter the poem by not referencing his own father. And uncluttering is probably an unfortunate turn of phrase, but I hope you know what I mean. By focusing on what he picked out of Aeneid 6, which was, to me, regret and loss. And there may well have been things he regretted about his father and feelings of loss that he had. But he was looking at it through a very particular lens, so that's why I don't think he did reference him. But it is a really interesting question. I'm going to go away and think about that over a gin and tonic.
Any more questions?
Two quick questions, if I may. One is about the difficulty in people who are singing in church, singing classical Latin, because most of them don't know what it means. And, how do people cope? Because they may pull you into intervals, I don't know. And the other is, I came across something in the Edward Worth Library down in Dublin, which is an amazing library, which is now open to the public freely. It wasn't for several centuries. And discovered that there was a lady from Poland brought to work on some of the old medical texts because she had been taught both Greek and Latin, and said that behind the Iron Curtain, Greek and Latin were maintained.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that? Because it puzzled me.
Well, I can certainly tell you about, to take the second question first, I can certainly tell you about that, and yes, indeed it is. I had a colleague on the mainland who came from Romania, and her Latin and Greek was exceptional, absolutely exceptional. And she was horrified when she came here. She married an Englishman. She was horrified when she came here to see that it wasn't maintained in the same way. And I think, I'm not quite sure why that is. Perhaps it's something as simple that they see a value in it beyond what we do. And I think culturally, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, so sorry everybody, culturally I think we often are guilty of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If something is perceived as difficult or posh or not for our kind of people, we tend to just abandon it. Now, I come from West Belfast, from the Donegal Road to be absolutely precise, so it was a great astonishment to both my parents, who left school at 12, that I actually took to Latin. I was lucky I went to Methody and had this thing, and I just took to it like a duck, hopefully like a duck to water, but I loved it, absolutely. And they always looked at me in amazement as to why that? Why not something useful like maths? I couldn't count, so that was that. But I think in the behind the Iron Curtain, as it was in more Eastern countries, there is a much wider view of what is useful, and the same would extend actually into China, where I know, because I told her, a girl in Shanghai, who was in Shanghai, she's in Oxford now, who was an absolutely phenomenal student, who'd read most of ancient Greek philosophy in Greek, who was able to argue the toss about the niceties of Latin, and didn't think it was in any way weird or odd. So it is, I think, a cultural thing. I think we tend, as I say, just to go for what's easy rather than for what's rich. And that's something that does actually need to change. The first thing that you asked me was about, if you could remind me, church singing. There often is, I know from our own choir, there often is an English translation just underneath, so that makes my job a lot easier. But I also remember very
Translations are not always.
No, they're not at all. Oh yes, that is true. They're better than nothing, as people often say about translations, because at least it gives them the sense of what they're singing. But if there is a choir, and there sometimes are choirs, who want to know a bit more about the intricacies of it, I'm more than happy to help. But I can't help but remember Dr. Moraine, who was my first Latin teacher, used to absolutely roll his eyes every time we sang anything in Latin, whether it was the school song or anything else where it had a C in it, because Mr. McKay would insist on a soft C, whereas he would roar, "No, it's a hard C, conquer Thomas, not concert Thomas." And that is the one thing about singing in Latin that has stuck with me all my life, and I still tut quietly when I hear a soft C being sung. That bothers me more than them knowing what it means to be actually grateful. I blame him.
Maybe we've got time for one last question, and then I have a burning question they want to ask. I think all the burning questions have been asked.
Oh, thank goodness.
I just want to thank Lynn for such a brilliant talk, and then a brilliant Q&A. So thank you very much for your interaction with that, and just so interested in the whole area about kind of the richness of that inheritance and acknowledging it and using it. And I suppose one of the ways that we can do it is by supporting the Classical Association in Northern Ireland and the work that they do, and also I suppose we'll be trying to do our bit here by having more talks like this. So please do come along and support the work, and thank you very much, and a special thank you to Lynn Lord.
Thank you for being a lovely audience.